Hey, what's up everybody? This is Super501 and today I want to go over my poison werewolf build for the Druid in Diablo 4. And just as a small disclaimer, this build is going to be a bit weaker than some of the more meta builds, such as say a pulverized Druid, but this build is probably one of the most unique builds I have seen in World Tier 4 that's able to do basically all of the endgame content. And this is basically just draft number 1. There's definitely a lot more work I want to put into this build. There's a lot more gearing and progression I still have to go with this build. And I think later on, once I get better gear and once I'm at say level 100 and have the Paragon board fully completed, I think this build will be quite a bit stronger relative to the level it'll be. And the basis of this build is to apply massive poisons to enemies and then use one of our legendary aspects mixed with Shred to massively increase the damage of our Shred and get these massive damage combos. And the most important legendary aspect for this build, and the one that actually makes it work, is while dashing, Shred seeks out nearby poison enemies, dealing up to 180% of the poisoning damage to them. And something to note, this does not remove the poison from them, it just does a lot more damage based off of the poison that's currently on them. And you'll see this in the gameplay when I poison an enemy and then leap to them with Shred, there's like a green line in between you and the enemy that shows you that this legendary aspect has worked. And one of the reasons this build can do so much damage is because this proc off this legendary aspect can crit. So now your Shred is doing a bunch of extra damage, scaling off of the poison on the enemy, and that extra damage that's scaled from that poison can also crit, giving it additional scaling. And even though bosses aren't a big part of Diablo 4 in the endgame, I think this build is probably one of the easiest builds to kill basically any bosses with. And I've two-shot multiple bosses in World Tier 4. So at the lowest point, this is going to be an incredibly strong bossing build. And next up, we have our skill tree, and there's actually been some variations I've been messing around with and testing out to see what could be better with this build. Now, originally I was using Storm Strike because it gives that damage reduction anytime you use it, and then it also has a good chance to apply vulnerable to enemies, but I've since been using Wind Shear because Wind Shear penetrates through enemies, and with the Wild Wind Shear upgrade, it grants more spirit for every enemy hit, and in World Tier 3 and World Tier 4, there's so many enemies that this is overall going to give you a lot more spirit, and this build is played a little bit more like a range build because of how we have to use our Shred. So you can use either one of these, but I think Wind Shear has been working better for me. So we're just 1 point in a Wind Shear, Enhanced Wind Shear for a chance to make enemies vulnerable, and then Wild Wind Shear, which grants that additional spirit after the first enemy hit. Then we're putting max points into our Shred. It's a 3-point combo with the last hit doing a lot more damage. And again, most of our damage is going to be scaled from Shred. Then we're getting upgrade 1, has more attack speed and now heals you anytime an enemy struck. And then we're going Primal Shred, and this is very important as well. Shred's second and third attacks also perform a dash. In addition, Shred's critical strike damage is increased by 20%. Now, as we went over with our legendary aspect, you have to be dashing for that additional damage to go off. So now all 3 of our attacks dash, and basically how this is going to work is you apply poison to enemies, then you go slightly out of range and use Shred, which will dash you back towards that enemy doing a lot of damage. Then you go back out of range of that enemy, dash back in, and you basically rinse and repeat that, because if you do it correctly, your Shred has 3 attacks, so you can dash 3 times to the same enemy, getting 3 procs of our legendary aspect. And this is primarily how you're going to have to play the build for the build to be doing any amount of decent damage. Then we put 1 point into Blood Howl. It heals you for 20% of your health at a base with a relatively low cooldown. Then upgrade 1, anytime you kill something, its cooldown is reduced by 1 second. And then I went with Innate Blood Howl. You also regenerate 20 spirit when you Blood Howl. And I think this is just much better for this build because we are a bit spirit starved, because the more Shreds we can get off, the more damage we're going to be able to do. And we're also going to be building up poison the more we're able to spam Shred. And since we're going to be resetting Blood Howl quite a bit, this can generate quite a lot of spirit. And I think it's better than getting 15% attack speed. And then we go down to our companions. Now, another part of the build is scaling our damage off of our companions and also having a big focus on Poison Creeper, because this is the other most important part of the build. The active of Poison Creeper causes a big AoE under you that immobilizes enemies and puts a massive poison over time on them. And this is where a lot of our damage is going to scale off of, because we pop our poison creeper, then we just start dashing to them with shred, and on world tier 4 I can legitimately one-shot elite enemies some of the times just by popping our poison creeper and dashing one time to them with shred. If it crits, you could potentially one-shot elites. And then we're getting upgrade 1, so the immobilize lasts longer. Upgrade 2 increases the duration of the poison by 3 seconds, and that's something that's pretty important as well. We want as long as a duration on all of our poisons as we can possibly get. And next up we have wolves. We only have 1 point in this, and these are primarily going to be used to scale our damage through some of our other aspects, and with another one of our aspects, these get turned into werewolves and they can apply rabies to enemies, which is another big poison. And then the first upgrade, they do more damage to poison or CC'd enemies, so they're going to be doing a lot more damage through that. And then we're going ferocious wolf pack. A lucky hit, your wolves have a chance to fortify you, just make you more tanky, because that has been one of the things I've been trying to go more into, is being a bit more tanky, because the build has been a bit squishy in world tier 4. Then we have 1 point in the ravens. This again is to help scale our damage through one of our aspects, but also the active on this has a pretty high lucky hit chance, so this is also going to help us reset our cooldowns from one of our spirit boons that we'll go over later. So upgrade 1, you do more critical strike chance when ravens hit something. Upgrade 2, you have 2 additional ravens that will periodically attack enemies. And then next category, we have rabies, and we have 5 points into this. Now the reason we're going rabies is because one of our legendary aspect turns our wolves into werewolves, and their attacks can spread rabies. And it's basically the same thing as us using the rabies ability and spreading it ourselves. That's why we want 5 points into this, because this is also going to apply a pretty big poison over time. Then the first upgrade, rabies deals more damage the longer it's been on the target. Then upgrade 2, rabies spreads 100% faster. Because if you have rabies on a ton of different enemies and you shred at them, our legendary aspect is going to cause that effect on all enemies in the area, potentially just wiping out big groups of enemies. And then finally, for our capstone, we have lupine ferocity. Every 6 werewolf skill critically hits and deals 60% increased damage. And with shred being a combo of 3 attacks, we're getting this proc every other shred, so just a bunch of guaranteed crits and a lot more damage. And then past that, we just have passives. Now I've been switching up passives, trying out some different things, but I've been going a lot more into defensive passives lately. And if you feel like your build's a bit more tanky, you could potentially go into more utility or more damage. Well, first off, 1 point in Heart of the Wild to get to abundance, so basic skills generate 18% more fury. We want a basic skill as least as possible, so this is going to help with that. Then we're going down, getting 3 points into predatory instinct. Critical strike chance against close enemies is increased by 6%. Now anything that buffs us when close to enemies is good, because our shred, when it deals damage, you're close to the enemy because you leap to them. So all that stuff is still going to affect this build correctly. Then we're going 3 points into ancestral fortitude, increases all non-physical resistances by 15%, pretty good defensive. Then vigilance, you gain 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using a defensive skill, which is our blood howl, which we could have up white a lot of the time because we're resetting it when getting kills, or lowering the cooldown when getting kills. Then lower in the tree, we go 1 into neurotoxin to get toxic claws. Critical strikes with werewolf skills deal 23% of their base damage as poisoning over 4 seconds. Now this is actually very important, and if you can get an item with more ranks into toxic claws, that'll be really good. I haven't gotten any of that on a well-rolled item yet, but the reason this is so good is because anytime our shred will crit, it's going to apply this poison over time. But if we keep critting on the same target, it'll keep building up this poison. And with our main legendary aspect that causes shred to proc that damage from poisoning, that's considered another hit for shred. So not only can the normal attack of shred proc toxic claws, but the proc of our legendary aspect can also proc toxic claws. So now you can just potentially be building up this poison pretty effectively, just getting crits off of our shred. And then envenom, poison enemies take 30% additional critical strike damage, helps us get those really big crits with shred. Then I went down and put a final point into defensive posture, increases the amount of fortify you gain from all effects by 5%. That's primarily from our wolves, so they can fortify, so now we get a little bit more fortify. And that's another way I've just trying to been making the build a little bit more tanky. And you can have 2 more additional points in this if you have all the skill points, and I would probably just put those passives into some other defensive effects, or if you're able to stay alive, put them into some more offensive passives. And next up, we have our Spirit Boons. On Snake, we have critical strikes with shapeshifting skills, heal you for 3% of your maximum life. And we're going to be shapeshifted most, if not all of the time. So just adding a lot of additional healing. Then Pack Leader, this is the most important one. Lucky hit, critical strikes have a 20% chance to reset the cooldown of all of your companion skills. Now this is so important because of Poison Creeper. This is our main damage scaling. So we want to reset this as much as possible, because if we go Poison Creeper a pack and shred into it, like I mentioned, you could almost insta-kill that entire pack. So having Poison Creeper up as much of the time as possible is just going to make the build ridiculous. In fact, this is actually one of the biggest downsides of this build, that it's so reliant on Poison Creeper. Then we have critical strike chance increase, and then maximum life increase. If you're not having difficulties surviving, you can take the 30% increased critical strike damage instead of the maximum life. And then top row, I'm getting the reduced cooldown on control impairing effects. But if that's not been a big issue for you, you can also go 10% damage reduction from elites. And that brings us to our items. So first I want to go over all the legendary aspects. First being on your weapon. We already went over this. This is our main damaging aspect. Shred's not going to deal more damage. Scaling off of our poisons, you want this on your weapon so it gets that 2 times effect. This is the most important one, but this is also a pretty rare aspect. It took me a while to even get one of these, so you might have to go farm if you want to try out this build. Then on our gloves, we're using Blood Howl, increases critical strike chance by up to 10%, and Blood Howl now affects your nearby companions and players. So now when using this, you'll heal yourself, your companions, and any players, and they'll also get that critical strike chance increase. We're primarily just using this for the critical strike increase because it is pretty strong. Then on our necklace, we're using your wolf companions are now werewolf companions. They deal up to 150% increased damage, and they can spread rabies. This is very important, so they can spread that rabies, allowing you to shred them and deal a ton of additional damage. And I've been toying around putting a different aspect on my necklace because I'm using wolves a lot less for damage now and much more so they can spread rabies, which is based off our own rabies. So it's not technically based off their scaling. So there might be a better aspect to put on our amulet and put this on a ring or on our gloves. Then for our rings, we have you gain 1 additional companion, and in addition, your companion skills deal 20% more damage. And this is really strong for 2 reasons. First off, the more companions, which is going to scale with another one of our aspects, and then 20% skill damage, very good for our Poison Creeper. And then our other ring, core skills deal an additional 8% damage for each active companion. Now this was hard to test, but I did look this up, and pretty much all the other information I could find is that this aspect scales per companion you have, not skill. So we have 1 Poison Creeper, potentially 2 depending on how this first aspect works, but then we have 3 wolves, so that's 3 more stacks of that, and then we have 4 ravens. All of these different companions giving us an additional 8% damage. So this is just going to allow our shred, which is our core skill, to scale even more. And then on our boots, we have you have 20% increased crowd control duration. While enemies are unstoppable, you deal up to 50% increased damage to them. Now, from what I've seen, bosses are considered unstoppable, so this will be dealing 50% more damage to them, but also anytime enemies you're facing become unstoppable, you're just going to be doing a lot more damage. And the increased crowd control is nice for the root from Poison Creeper. Just keeps them in place longer, so you can keep getting out of range of them to shred them from range much more easily. Then on our legs, we have gain up to 50% damage reduction while shapeshifted into a werewolf. This is going to be really good to stay alive longer, just a good damage reduction while in your werewolf form. And then on our chest, we're actually using Mad Wolf's Glee. Werewolf is now your true form, so you're always in werewolf when in combat unless you switch out of it, and you gain +2 ranks to all your werewolf skills, which is how we have more ranks into Blood Howl, into Shred, and we just get to sit in our werewolf form all the time. Now, if you don't have this unique, just get basically any other defensive aspect that sounds good for this build. But this does seem to be one of the more common uniques. I've gotten this a lot more than most of the other uniques I've gotten. Then on our helm, you gain stacking armor for 4 seconds whenever you deal damage, stacking up to 30%, or if you have a better roll, up to 50%, just making you a lot more tanky. Now, for the rolls on all of your armor and weapons, you're basically just wanting to scale all of your main damage numbers. So damage over time, damage to close enemies, core skill damage, and then all stats or willpower, which is your primary stat. And that's basically what you want on everything. On something like your boots, I went a bunch of resistance rolls on my boots to stack up that resistance to be more tanky. And then damage reduction while fortified is something you can go into that could be pretty good because our wolves will constantly be fortifying us. Damage reduction from close enemies could be good because you have to jump into a shred to damage them. And my legs are probably one of my worst rolled pieces right now, so you can definitely get a lot better than this. But then on our gloves, we have plus ranks to shred, really good. Lucky hit chance is going to be very good as well. Because of how the lucky hit chance additional modifier works, this is going to give us a lot of lucky hit chance to reset our companion skills even more. Very good for poison creeper. Then you have things like critical hit chance, critical hit damage, always going to be good, and a physical damage because our shred is still a physical attack, so that's still going to be scaling our shred damage. Damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, very good for defensive. We basically always have enemies poisoned. And my helm is something I definitely think I want to roll as well. It's decent, but I don't think I want as much going into wolves as I have on this helm right now. +3 to poison creeper is going to be massive on your helmet as well. And on our necklace, we have more willpower scaling. We have werewolf skill damage, which is going to affect our shred. We have rank to all companion skills. That one's still pretty good because of poison creeper. Cooldown reduction. I might actually want to go more into cooldown reduction because we're so reliant on poison creeper, but that'll require some more testing. Then we just have more poison damage, damage to poison enemies, and then critical strike chances or damages, and the same thing with our other ring. And then finally, we have our Paragon tree. Now, I think I'm probably going to redo my Paragon tree to try to be a bit more optimal with it. So I'm just going to go over the main pieces for you. One of the most important glyphs for this build is going to be Tracker. You gain increased damage to poison targets for all the dexterity and range of this glyph, but the secondary effect is poisoning damage effects last 33% longer. Now, this is very important because we want enemies poisoned all the time. Even if there's just a small poison on an enemy, you're going to be getting that legendary aspect proc, which can crit itself to proc more things, and is just going to be doing a lot of additional scaling off of even small poisons. Then for our first board, we went Heightened Malice. When 3 or more poison enemies are near you, deal 45% increased damage, massive scaling increase. So that's really good for the first board. Then our glyph on this board is Bane. You deal more poison damage for every 5 intelligence purchased within range. And then the secondary effect, poison damage effects have a 10% chance to deal double the damage over their duration. So again, more poison scaling, more damage off our shred, and just more damage from the poison itself. So this is a really good glyph to scale and get a lot of intelligence around it. Then our second board, we have Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 spirit, and this can stack. So if you jump into a group of enemies and crit them multiple times, this effect will proc multiple times. This is very good for being able to just shred a lot more. And the final glyph we're using for right now is Werewolf. You deal more damage in werewolf form based on how much willpower is in the area. And then the secondary effect, you gain 10% damage reduction while in werewolf form. Since we're going to be in werewolf form almost all the time, this is just a good damage reduction. And then I've just been putting points into any of the rare nodes that give us damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, damage to poison enemies again. We got some poison resistance right here because this is just a lot of resistance for one node right there. And then basically anything else is going to increase your damage. And then if you need to be more tanky, start getting anything that's going to make you more tanky. So we have werewolf skill damage right there. And then we're just getting a bunch of other nodes to help scale our glyphs. And again, I'm probably going to be remaking this. And obviously there's a lot more leveling I have to do, but I think you get the gist of what you should be going for. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
Wait a minute.